An American, a Scot, and a Canadian are in a terrible car accident. They're all brought to the same emergency room, but all of them are just too badly injured. They all die. Just as they're about to put the toe tag on the American, though, he stirs and opens his eyes. Astonished, the doctors and nurses say, "Well, what happened?" And the American said, "I remember this crash, and then there was this beautiful light, and then the Canadian and the Scot and I were all standing there at the gates of heaven." St. Peter approached us and he said, "We've made a mistake. I'm sorry. It was a mistake in accounting. We're going to send the guy to hell. But we need a processing fee. Each of you needs to pay us $100 processing fee, and we'll send you back to your lives because you were not supposed to come up yet." And so the American said, "I pulled out my wallet and I paid the $100, and so here I am back." And the doctor and nurse both celebrated and said, "Well, that's great that you're here, but what happened to the Scot and the Canadian?" And the American said, "Well, last time I saw him, the Scot was haggling over the price, and the Canadian was waiting for the government to come pay it for him." Leaders advise people in developing nations, you can see it. Remember, those poor folks in other nations are desperate to become free and prosperous, to have enough liberty to raise their children and enough money to support them. What do we tell them when they ask about the good society? Do we say they need the rule of law, that they need a functioning economy, that they need to guarantee private property, that they need honest judges and a system for adjudicating disputes that's fair and predictable, a private banking system, private monetary system to mediate complex financial transactions and provide the loans and liquidity necessary for growth? You know the answer. No, we don't. What do we tell them? Have elections. Sweet, fancy Moses. Look how well that's working for us. We're telling developing nations to adopt the worst, most dysfunctional part of our system and expect them to climb that stairway to the North American dream. Just have elections. You'll be farting through silk in no time. I can wait. As is all too evident in the daily news, this path has led them not toward the dream we all prize, but rather toward the nightmare that we all fear. Nations that have tried to develop by adopting majority rule institutions have nearly always failed unless they already put in place the other institutions that are necessary to guarantee liberty. Why? Why is that? Why is it that without judges, property rights, and rule of law, majority rule always fails? The answer is majority rule is two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for lunch. Libertarians are not for majority rule as any kind of moral principle. In a democracy, perhaps we are sometimes forced to use elections and majority rule as a way to decide things, but it's not the core of our system. Majority rule can be a protection against tyranny by an elite, but it creates another danger at least as great. There is no moral force in the majority. It's just what most people happen to think. That can't be the bedrock for a party that wants to stand for what is truly free. Then what are we for? What is the system that we think other nations should look to and adopt? Well, it's real democracy, not majority rule. Real democracy has next to nothing to do with majority rule. Now, what do I mean by democracy? Let me tell you a brief story. And examples of this story, almost exactly the same fact, have happened over and over again around the world. In the late 1990s, in a town called Niano, in the West African nation of Mali, a number of Peace Corps and other aid agencies worked to help the 50,000 residents. One problem they faced in Niano was the shortage of water and the control of water that they did have. There was a large drainage ditch that was more ditch than drainage. It didn't really drain anywhere. It was a huge collector of animal carcasses, human waste, and mosquito larvae. A Dutch group installed a pump. It made a big difference. Water was cleaned up, malaria and other diseases were greatly reduced, and when rainwater did collect in the ditch, it could be pumped out for irrigation for crops. After the pump was installed, the drinking water supply was no longer fouled by floods of waste. The aid agencies, one by one, moved on to other projects, other villages, maybe even other parts of the world. They left the care and the maintenance of the Nyano pump to local government officials. How's that going to turn out? One of the Peace Corps workers returned to the village. 5 years later, things looked pretty much the same. Same streets, trees, but the pump had broken years before. And the agent of the government had made no move to fix it, preferring to keep the taxes for himself. All the pump needed to work again and solve the problem was a machined part that cost less than $100. But because no one fixed the pump, 10% of the town contracted malaria every year. That's 10% new cases every year. Some people had recovered. They may have caught it 3 or 4 times, but 10% new cases every year because this village of 50,000 couldn't get a $100 machined part. The returning Peace Corps worker asked why no one had fixed the pump. And the people of the town said they're waiting for the government to do it. It's like the Canadian in heaven. They're very angry. They were sick and weak, and no one would help them. Far from lifting them up, the help of the NGOs had only left them more dependent on government and less able to care for themselves. You see, once a society comes to believe that no one has the power to fix things, and that we have to wait on government, we all become sick and angry. Those people in Nyano, they could have worked together, pooled their resources, and fixed that pump, but they have no sense of private personal empowerment. They've been taught since birth, since their grandparents' birth, to think of themselves as children in a family headed by the state. So the well-intentioned help of the Peace Corps volunteers only made that worse. Townspeople sat around waiting in vain for the government to save them while they died of malaria. If when the pump had been installed, the Peace Corps worker could also have talked about responsibility and liberty, many more lives could have been saved. Once started, that process is self-perpetuating. I can use my own money. I can use my own ingenuity rather than wait for the government. That's the stairway to liberty and prosperity. In 1831, a Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville published a memoir of his travels in the United States called Democracy in America. Might as well have been called How Americans Get Things Done. Tocqueville marveled at how Americans work together privately to solve civic problems. Now, he was no fan of majority rule, of political democracy, and that's the heart of the distinction that I want to make. It's the difference between political democracy and private democracy. We have become invested in political democracy. We need to invest ourselves and our efforts in private democracy. Problem with political democracy, Tocqueville said, is that the citizens are isolated and feeble. They can do hardly anything by themselves, and they can't force others to help them. Now, he admired the American solution to the problem, and that is organize into private groups and leave government out of it. I'm quoting de Tocqueville. They all therefore become powerless if they do not learn voluntarily to help one another. If men living in democratic countries had no right and no inclination to associate for political purposes, their independence would be in jeopardy. So what that means is nations have to defend themselves from external aggression because other nations may be organized in the same way. So maybe they would have some problem with their independence. But they might long preserve their wealth and their cultivation. So without political organization, maybe we have a problem from outside, but we could long preserve our wealth and cultivation. Whereas, if they never acquired the habit of forming associations in private, ordinary life, civilization itself would be in danger. So, to translate, politics can't solve problems. People solve problems, or they don't. They sit and they wait for the pump to be rebuilt. Equating democracy with majority rule misses the point completely. Private voluntary associations are the essence, the very essence of liberty.